Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Becky Aiken, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Galen Clavio. We are excited. Sometimes I forget that not everybody watches it via video, so can't see motions and facial expressions
I just saluted the audience. Sorry, I'll kinetically caption myself from this point forward.
It's okay. I listen to a lot of podcasts that also have video ones, and I always hear them say, "If you're not watching us," and they try to discuss what they're doing. So, this week's topic, this podcast topic, is about planning for being gone for conferences or other events. Sometimes when you can plan ahead for it, and how we approach our classes in a world where there's a lot of ways that we can reconfigure student work when we have to be gone. And we'll talk a little bit about it from the context of, it's the beginning of the semester. I'm working through my course schedule. I've got 3 conferences this fall, so a decent amount of travel coming up, and I can think through the course schedule to kind of make sure that we don't miss as much work as we might otherwise if I weren't planning ahead. And then also sometimes what you do when unexpected things come up and you have to miss, like you get really sick, you have a family member that gets really sick, a funeral to go to, things that maybe are out of your control. And this popped into my head partially because I am doing some planning for my fall classes, but I've talked a lot with my husband about this actually because we have small children who, when I was in California, were sick every week. I didn't work a full week the first year we lived in California. I did not work a full week because I had a kid home at least 1 day a week. And I remember us talking a lot about what do I do for my classes? Because when I was in college, right, if the professor couldn't come to class, it was canceled. Class was canceled. That's all. That's it. Nothing else. There was no additional assignments. You might not even get an email. You walked up to the door and you saw the sign that said so and so is not coming today. And even though we had technology before 2020 that would have allowed us to approach that differently, and certainly we were sending emails to our students when we had to cancel class right before 2020. It's almost like once we realized during COVID that, hey, there's all these tools out there that we could use for classes when we can't physically be there. And some of us learned at least somewhat how to teach online or how to teach in a synchronous Zoom environment. The options of what we could do if we were going to be gone expanded exponentially in our brains. Again, these things existed before 2020, but it's like most of us didn't teach online, and we certainly, if we taught online, didn't teach synchronously, right? Those were all more online asynchronous classes. So we didn't think about this being an option. And so that would be interesting for us to kind of talk through, how this has evolved a little bit, what we do as both faculty members, but then our perspective as people who work with or oversee other faculty and what they should do, and maybe even school policies within this space. And I'm actually curious for kind of starting off, I've never actually asked students this, and maybe I should. That would be a good starting spot. What they expect, like in their minds, right? Or what is the ideal situation for them? Because I think we might assume they'd say no work, but I don't actually think that's the case for a lot of them. But I also think if you're going to say, your option is to do, I don't know, to watch this recorded lecture and do a discussion board, or your option is to create a case study, or your option is to meet synchronously via Zoom, they might have different perspectives than what we think they would say. So I'm curious what you think students expect in this space, Galen, or if you've ever had students talk to you about this as an administrator.
Well, no, I've never actually had students, because it's all over the board. And I think this is where I think at the core, most students are just like, oh, good, I don't have to go to class today. It's kind of like if you have a job and they call you and they're like, hey, we don't need you today. And you're like, great, I get the day off. I don't think they really think much deeper than that. because I just don't think most students in most disciplines map things out where they understand the roadmap of what the course is supposed to teach them in relation to what they're supposed to be learning as they move forward. Now, I do think there's some exceptions to that. I think, especially in a lot of business schools, students are like, well, I should get X number of classes for, and I need to learn all of these things. And a lot of times they do. And so I do think that there's some flexibility in the minds of students. But most of it is going to be, I had something on my calendar today. I no longer have it on my calendar. If the class is just canceled, they're not going to think about it much beyond that. Now, I will say this. It's interesting because I was one of the few people doing online synchronous courses long before COVID, which made the pivot to COVID seem simple in my mind, because it's like, well, I'm just going to do the stuff I was doing already in this synchronous setting. And it I will say the big challenge there for me has always been the size of the class that you're pivoting to the online environment. And do you look at the class, is it one of those things where I'm going to have an on so I did this a lot, that first COVID semester and the winter session that we did, which was a 7 weeks long class. And what I tried to do at first was, if I had to miss the class entirely, I would pre-record it and I would just have that available to everybody, and it would just be me talking and going through the lecture. But I'd also do classes where the regular sessions where I would do the class and I would let everybody attend live if they wanted to or not. And if they didn't want to, they could just watch the class later, a recorded version of it. They just wouldn't get to participate in the time. And at the time, a lot of students would choose to participate if it was available. They would choose to do the synchronous session. Now, that hardly ever happens. And everybody's just like, fine, just send me the video and I'll follow up afterwards. They don't really want to have the interaction in the moment. So I think as you take that into this larger issue of what do you do when you're planning on being gone, I think that now the generation 4 years later, they are so used to having prepackaged educational experiences. Even, and this, I know a lot of faculty won't want to hear this, but it's like, if you're willing to watch a how-to video on YouTube about something, is that really that fundamentally different from doing a similar kind of thing with a class session, but with the idea that instead of all of the ancillary conversation and questions that come in during a lecture that normally extends it to that 75-minute length or however long your classes are, you're boiling it down to the essentials and you're combining it with the readings or whatever else that they're supposed to do. That's been, I think, a reasonable approach, because it's less time for the faculty member, it's less time for the students, and it's not something you'd want to do every time, but it's an effective way of knocking out a class in a way that's both convenient for the person teaching and the person that's receiving the knowledge.
Well, I think that's oftentimes I think where I first go, right, is I will just record the lecture that I would have done anyway, and then usually try to plan it so that it's in conjunction with some sort of case study or assignment that we were working on. So, for example, if we've got a semester long social media marketing plan, right, and we're going to miss class, I'll record the target audience lecture and then say, create a draft of this section for this thing you have to do anyway. So I'm not necessarily adding busy work, but I'm getting them a chance to create a draft for something for me to give you feedback on, so that we're making progress in the class without it feeling like I'm adding additional things that I might not have done otherwise just because I'm going to be gone. And that's kind of where I struggle. I struggle with it in a little bit of in two ways. And generally speaking, I try to do what you just said, which I think is probably a common thing for faculty, at least from what I hear, is that they just take the content they would have covered, they record it, and then maybe they do or do not have some sort of new assignment, or they try to tie it to a current assignment. I do think other faculty just cancel class altogether, which we can talk about this a little bit as administrators. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that either as a move, depending on how many times you're gone. But the thing that I struggle with sometimes is if I give them the lecture that I would have covered, how do I replicate their interaction with the content in a way that gets them to remember it without adding on busy work that they're going to see as busy work? Because that's kind of annoying, and that not necessarily if it's not doing a good job of providing value, maybe not what I want to do, right? I don't want them to feel like, "Oh, Dr. Aiken can't be here, so she's just dumping something else on us."
Right.
So there's that element of it that I think about a little bit. And then the other thing I will sometimes do is think about actually hosting a synchronous session. So when I travel to Sport Marketing Association conference, I have to leave on a Tuesday. I have
Mhm.
a Tuesday afternoon class. I could fly in early enough on Tuesday morning to do a synchronous Zoom session for Tuesday afternoon class for what would normally be an in-person class, right? So like this is not a normal way that we deliver the class. And I struggle with knowing whether that's really the move to do because if it's a class where they're used to seeing you in person, is that synchronous class really going to replicate the environment anyway? Or is it something that is going to feel forced or off? I struggle with that a little bit too. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I'm curious when you look at those options in addition to the recording the lecture, what you think.
Well, first of all, I will say I think it's fascinating that in an industry that's increasingly seeing the importance of undergraduate teaching or teaching in general, graduates as well, that conferences have increasingly gotten more in the middle of the week when people are likely to need to be teaching. It's almost like, it's like I remember hearing a faculty member anecdotally tell another faculty member, if you're focusing on your classes, you're doing it wrong. And it's like, wow, what a terrible message. And I kind of feel that way about how a lot of conferences have gone with this, where it'll be like Friday to Tuesday, or it'll be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of a week when you're almost certainly getting some impact on what you're teaching. And it's just like, it's fine. So that's a separate philosophical conversation to have. I will say, I think it's normally there's two things there that I'll throw in. I do build normally one or two flex days into a semester, knowing that it never hurts morale to say, hey, we're not going to have class on this day. Sometimes I'll even list something on the schedule, but know that I'll have an open date later where I'm actually going to do it. And I'll be like, let me give you guys a day off to kind of reset. Here's some readings maybe to do, but don't worry about the actual class session because we'll hit that next time. Now, am I technically supposed to do that? Probably not. But I also think that there's sometimes to be able to effectively convey what's going on in the class, it's good to have some built-in times where you're asking to do something outside of class, even in a larger scale class. And I'll know oftentimes like what I need to teach in the class might only take 14 weeks instead of the 15 or 16 that I've got on the calendar. So, and again, if all you're doing is teaching, if you're just a lecturer, not just, but you know what I mean? Like the lecturer where you're teaching is your thing, you're not responsible for research, you're not having to go to conferences, then that's a different environment. But if you're a tenure stream faculty member, or if you have a lot of administrative duties, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that you have to be in the classroom every single time you're listed if it's going to be logistically impossible for you to do so. So you've got some flex days you can build in if there's external work that can be done. And in my area of media, there's a lot of opportunities for that, whether it's creating your own media projects or working with people on certain things, whatever. But then there's also the possibility of just scheduling in guest speakers that can run themselves. And that's something that I've done on a somewhat regular basis with this stuff as well, where if I'm teaching, so I normally have a very good graduate student that works with me in my sports media industry class, and we will set it up because I want to give her opportunities to lecture. So she'll take the lecture on the topics that she's the most interested in, and we'll build that into the schedule because I'll know ahead of time I'm not going to be there that Monday. We have career services on campus, and they'll always offer, like, if you've got a class that you can't make, we'd be happy to take over that session. And it would be different than what you would normally be teaching, but it's still something we want to get students in touch with. And we can do a special version of what we would present based upon your class and what those people would be interested in. So there are some in the box options that you could use that wouldn't be a synchronous Zoom that you're doing. I don't think it hurts to change things up every once in a while and either have a day where you've got nothing going on or a day where you're doing something different and maybe it's not even you doing it, but it still fits into the overall confines of the class. That's kind of how I would approach that.
Yeah, I love that. I'm kind of with you whether it's what we are supposed to do or not. Missing a couple class sessions a semester to give students just like a brain break, I think is fine. I know most students I know are taking at least 15 credits, but many are taking 18 to 21. And I recognize that that's a choice that they made. But at the same time, that 1.5 hour that we give them back may allow them to reset and actually come back more refreshed. It's no different than us taking vacation from our jobs, right? You take a vacation day, you don't think about work, you come back, you might come back with a different perspective. And so I think I'm kind of with you. I think occasionally that there's not necessarily anything wrong with just letting it be, and or scheduling in a work day if you have a major project and you just want them to have an opportunity to work on it. And if you have a TA, you could say an optional class session where you can come in and ask questions. But that's another great example, Galen, of using resources around you. It's probably not just career services. There's probably other entities on campus who would love to come talk to your students, and they can tailor a presentation around something that matters to the students and improves their life and professional abilities in the future. And that's a good thing to look at too, is to explore. And if you don't know what those are, talk to other faculty, right? Reach out to different departments, just ask and see if they have anything they might be able to deliver.
It's something that, again, I think even in very nutrient dense courses, for lack of a better term, where you really need all of the time, if you've got a time, this is where if there's a really good video that you want them to watch or a really good podcast you want them to listen to, schedule that. Like that's your class this day, because it would be, you may not get them to listen to it on their own outside of class if it's an hour and a half long. But if you're like, hey, instead of the regular session, this is your assignment, you're going to get quizzed on it, so take the time to listen to it, that's perfectly acceptable. And this is where we again, historically, there's been this attitude that somehow the lecture has got to be separate from the material. But when the material is essentially a lecture or stands in for a lecture, like a podcast or a video, how fair is it to tell students, go watch this thing for an hour and a half? Like, rarely are you going to assign a reading that takes an hour and a half, but you might get more out of the video or more out of the podcast. So there are things that you can plug into this technologically now that should be philosophically fine, that we wouldn't have even thought about 20 years ago. But it is essentially, if you think back to our elementary and middle school experiences, how many times did you have a substitute teacher where they just threw something on the VCR? It's not a whole lot different from what we're talking about here. It's just now you don't need the VCR. You got YouTube.
And you don't have to be in the same room doing it. They can
Right.
do it. They have their own technology. That's a really good one. You mentioned guest speakers. I will sometimes record guest speaker spots
Yep.
at a different time, and then they will watch them during that session. So
I do that all the time. Same
that's such
thing.
a good, yeah, that's such a good use of time, because we've talked about this in previous pods, but over and over again, my students will say guest speakers are one of the most valuable parts of class. So I know that they're going to be likely to listen to it, even though it is, in place of a class session where they could just blow it off. And I always make students write reflections about what they learned, what they'll do about it, and what it means for them. And so those are relatively difficult to fake. And it's not like I did the interview, right? So it's not like they can say so and so said this
Right.
and they didn't actually say it, because I know what they said. So that's one of maybe the better ways if you want to even add additional value in the classroom when you're going to be gone.
Yeah. No, it's very much one of those things where the a lot of how you approach guest speakers can speak directly to how you are presenting or positioning external expertise in the subject matter that you're providing. I love using, I don't use, I used to use a lot more guest speakers, and now I only use about 2 or 3, but I really try to pick and choose based upon what's going to have the most impact in the minds and the eyes of students, and where is my expertise the shallowest, where an external voice would make more sense to talk about it. And I think that the one thing about using it in lieu of being there, if you're going to pre-record it, I do think that that's the way to go, because I think where I can come in and where I need to do the a particular type of job with the subject matter is I need to act as the moderator essentially between the students and the faculty or and the guest speaker, because I need to be almost like the translator of why this is important. I need to be able to ask certain questions, even when I'm in person. So, soliciting questions ahead of time, asking those questions, but also asking your own questions if the questions that the students are asking aren't actually giving them the things that they need to know, that I know that they need to know, but they may not know that they need to know. That's where doing what you just described, I think, is a really effective way of going about things.
And that's a great point. If you're pre-recording, that doesn't mean students don't get an opportunity to ask questions. Send in the LinkedIn bio of the person, give them a little bit of background and say, send me questions that you want me to ask and I will ask them. That way they still get their voice heard, even if it can't be in a live one-on-one.
Yep.
And from my experience, they're more likely to ask questions in that instance anyway than they are in a live, Zoom call or in-person speaking session for the most part. Maybe not graduate students, but certainly undergraduate students.
Right.
So, before we finish for today, I say that I know we have a little bit of time left, but I also know how we get going and then suddenly the time is over. So, I'm curious as an administrator, as somebody who, is in charge of faculty to some extent, how do you kind of view how faculty approach planning for being gone and also how they handle, illness, other unexpected being gone issues in their work?
I find most faculty are pretty good about thinking about these things ahead of time. Actually, just before we started the podcast, I was on a call with a faculty member who were having to change the class they're teaching because the class they were originally assigned to isn't going to make enrollment. And they had planned their travel schedule around being there on Tuesdays and Thursdays when their original class was. And now we're having to shift that to Monday, Wednesday. So they were like, there's like 3 classes I'm not going to be able to make. And I'm like, that's fine. We'll work with you on the approach. But I basically just told them the exact same things we've been talking about in this podcast, where it's like, well, we have guest speakers, we have other faculty members that can come in. This is a survey style class, larger class. So there's more tools available to address that. But look, generally speaking, I can't think of very many problems, if any problems at all, with faculty not taking their absence seriously and having some idea of what they want to do with that open space. And I am generally pretty deferential to faculty about that. The only time I would get involved, and it would be really more just like an initial conversation, like, what are we doing? What was the thought process here? Is if I see a lot of complaints on evaluations after the fact, where it's like, well, we didn't meet 4 or 5 times. And there wasn't really anything that was used to make up that time. Most of the time, it depends on the discipline. Like, journalism faculty and media content faculty will generally have students go and make things or critique things and then turn that in. And I'm normally fine with that as long as it ties back to the learning objectives. People that are in more conceptual, theoretical style classes, it's normally readings. It's kind of harder core stuff, but sometimes it'll be go do this exercise, and that'll take the place of things. And generally, most faculty are pretty good about planning around when they're teaching. They do take those times seriously. It's yet to be something that's been on my radar as something that I have to intervene in, and I think that's good, because I'd hate to get to a point where faculty just don't take their classes seriously to the point where they weren't even bothering to make up time that they were missing. I've yet to see anything like that.
Yeah, I haven't. I mean, I'm just getting started overseeing faculty, but in my experience as a student many, many moons ago, I did have a couple professors who literally never had class.
Yeah,
Now, nobody liked their class, so nobody complained about it.
that's a different
Um,
story altogether.
that that is and that's like, those are the faculty, they were tenured, right? So there was nothing that the university thought they could do, especially back then, that those things have evolved a little bit. But I don't think, generally speaking, there's a large amount of faculty who are just blowing off classes and calling it good. So I don't anticipate having a lot of those issues, but I do think as administrators or as people who are, in that overseeing role, we can do a better job of saying, hey, if you have, a sick kid at home, right? Like you can't control that, it's last minute. What if you had a couple back pocket things ready at the start of the semester that were if I need this, I could do this type of situation? Talk through some of these additional options for those faculty who are planning to be gone, just so that they know, like, here are some things you could do, especially if you're new and you've never thought about this before. I think that's one role we can probably do better as administrators to help those faculty figure it out.
Yeah, I do think that you shouldn't take, as an administrator, you shouldn't take anything for granted. But you also, depending on your level of administration, like if you're a department chair, or if you're running an academic program and you're in charge of scheduling and things like that, it never hurts to just have a conversation in a meeting, with a faculty meeting or whatever, about this topic, and approach it in a non-threatening manner, but just let people share, let especially seasoned faculty share what they do. And don't just cold call on them during the meeting, but say ahead of time, you got a couple associate professors and a full professor who are pretty good instructors. Bring it up as a topic and say, we're always evaluating how we're doing in the classroom, and evaluating teaching. We wanted to just talk about, what do you do when you have to miss for conferences or whatever, and let people hear some examples. I don't think that you can assume that new faculty especially have much of a background in this. And a lot of times people will default to either what their mentors did, which sometimes is not what you want to default to, and certainly not what I would want you to default to as a faculty member working at my institution. But sometimes it's the opposite direction, where people are doing these wild travel plans because they're like, I can't possibly miss teaching my class. And it is like, there is a little bit of wiggle room here, and you can build that in. It's just a matter of how you go about doing it, and what is it your class is about. What are you teaching, and what is appropriate for that particular subject matter? That's ultimately what I would say. You want to do with younger faculty. You don't want to be heavy-handed with it, but if they're clearly struggling with it, don't be afraid to have a conversation with them. But a lot of it can be accomplished simply by, they will listen for people who have something to say. And your job as an administrator is to put the people in position who you think have good things to say, to be able to say those things in front of those people.
Well, and it was not something in my training manual when I started. I don't think it is for anybody. I try to use that like facetiously. I didn't get a training manual. I think most of us don't. And so it can be useful though, because I had some former students who were first time faculty who were like, what do other people do?
Yeah.
I don't want to ask, right? I don't want to ask the department chair what I should do because I don't know how to respond if they say this, or like they just, it's kind of a weird dynamic when you start with the
Mm-hmm.
department chair, and so they were just worried about it. And so it's one of those things we probably could be more transparent with early on as administrators and open that door, because we know it's going to happen. We know people are going to have unexpected and expected things that they're going to have to miss for to do their job, and it's, again, in some cases they can't control it.
You really owe. I mean, this is one of the big problems in academia in general, is that there are not a lot of people to ask questions about that aren't in a position to judge you for asking the question.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things where, and it kind of goes back to our last episode about being yourself and being confident, but also understanding the circumstances that you find yourself in. And it would be, I think, a great idea for most schools and departments to have almost like an ombudsman who's not, who's like separate, like who's associate or full professor level, but is not in the hierarchy of the administration, who can nevertheless give good advice about how to best conduct oneself in things like this. And I've tried to be that person as best I can, but I know that people will look at me and say, "Oh, associate dean, that they're
Correct.
they're not going to have my best interests at heart." You can only do so much, but I do think that it would be helpful, and I understand there's political reasons why people don't want to do this, but it would be helpful to have setups where faculty can go. And unfortunately, like a lot of the places that try to provide those services, like the we have a society of teaching and learning on campus, but there's staff who don't really understand the political dynamics that faculty often have to deal with. What you
Correct.
really need is somebody who does understand those dynamics, who can help walk you through some of the best practices, understanding that a lot of people can't even decide on what the best practices are within a school or a department. So maybe what I'm asking for can't exist
Is
in the first place,
it?
but it's a great concept, you know?
I mean, maybe one of us should give it a try in upcoming years, and we can report back.
You should just appoint yourself as the ombudsman for this particular area of your university. Just see what they say, you
See
know?
what they say. Just add it to my signature line.
That's right.
So, that this has been a great conversation. Some kind of final points to make as you think about what you will do when you know you're going to be gone or when it comes up unexpectedly. Whatever choice you make, we've given you some great ideas here, but whatever choice you make, always reorient your brain and frame it and make sure that it's providing value for the students that, and Galen mentioned this multiple times, that connects to something you're trying to do in the course, or in those cases where you might use an external university presentation, something that connects to their social, emotional, mental, professional well being and development. Don't just give work to give work because you feel like if somebody found out you were gone and didn't give work, that you would get in trouble, right? That's not a good reason to do what you're doing, and make it clear what you expect students to do when you are gone, because you remember that there is, even if you tell them in the last class, like, I'm going to be gone next week, here's what I want you to do, you still need to email them about it the day of the class or the day before the class, because they will not remember. They have multiple classes. And to be honest, if you said it at the end of a class, everybody's at the end of their brain attention anyway. So the likelihood of that sticking is pretty small. So make it clear, make it simple, explain it well and communicate it to students, and just make sure you're always considering the value of the choice that you make.
Yep. I think I have nothing 100, 10 out of 10, no notes. That's great. So
10 out of 10. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us again on the Prof Talk Pod. Please subscribe to the channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, please subscribe, leave us a review. It really helps us get found. The goal for this academic year is to increase the reach of the podcast. We're getting a lot of great comments from the people who do listen that it's helpful and useful. That's why we're doing it. That's why we're showing up. So please share this with somebody that you think could benefit. And we will see you next time.